Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. With me tonight, Murray Dam, the assistant editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, Lindsay Powell, news editor, Mark McCaffrey, and Mark DeSantis, who are both regular contributors. And my name is Jasper Orthuis, and I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine. And today we're going to talk about the latest issue, issue 16.5, which deals with the Roman Imperial Legion, at least a first part, probably. In the magazine, we went to about the year of the four emperors, so AD 69, starting in the reign of Augustus. And those roughly 100 years almost exactly 100 years, in fact, if you go from 31, will give us, I'm sure, plenty to talk about because we're on familiar terrain. And for once, as I put in my editorial, we actually have a lot of sources, although the sources for the questions that we get might still be lacking. It's just all relative.
Well, I think that was one of the things, is that this is the classic legionary period. This is the legionary that is in all film any time from Romulus through to the late Rome, through to King Arthur even. It's the first century AD Roman legionary. And the funny thing putting it together was that the amount of times we had to go, no, that's too late. No, we can't include that. That's from Flavian legions, or that's from Trajannic legions. No, that's too early. So still within our parameters of this is the best known period of the Roman legionary. We still had, don't include that, that's the next issue. Oh, no, don't include that, that's the previous issue. There's still sort of extrapolations in both directions of what the life or the equipment of a legionary looks like, using the one piece of available evidence, which happens to be from 143 AD. And you're like, you can't use that. We have to come back and just look at that.
As all our regular listeners know, the frustrating refrain, we don't know. It's all ancient history is a litany of complaints of all the sources that have gone missing. It is just that this particular period, we are relatively well served with sources that haven't gone missing, or
Well, the good news is though, and even in the last 24 months, I mean, the archaeology is producing stuff that we didn't even imagine. So we might have a paucity of written sources, but we've got a good amount of archaeology in.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. I think we have, not even a relative. The written sources are not that bad. I mean, you don't have Polybius and Livy and all those things that we lean on so heavily for, say, the first century BC or for the Punic Wars. But yeah, we have so many more sources from archaeology, both in items that we find and texts that we find in inscriptions and papyri and all the other sources.
I think the other thing is, the picture we have, for instance, the ill-named Lorica segmentata, which now people talk about banded armor rather than using Lorica segmentata.
Which is not a very pretty word either.
Banded armor, no.
But you could always say the German Schienenpanzer, that has so much authority.
But the funny thing was that image, the image of that legionary also now is being altered by archaeology, as was seen on the cover, which is the Calicrisa segmentata, which is far too early, according to the accepted picture of the Roman legionary, the development of armor. So to be wearing, banded armor, Lorica segmentata in AD 9 doesn't fit. And it's like, but it fits. So therefore, the picture we had was wrong. So there's all these wonderful refinements.
But there are, so you talked about Calicrisa, but for example, from Dangstetten, which is 15 BC, there's evidence of this armor. So, so really, if it was in service at some degree or level in the Alpine German campaigns of that time, who's to say they were available, during the Antioch campaign? I mean, this is where it gets really interesting.
But all those early fragments are all relatively recent finds, aren't they? I mean, Calicrisa clearly, and Dangstetten is not very much longer ago, I think.
Yeah. So I think that idea, therefore, of the classic legionary, it's like, oh no, actually, it's a much longer period. And then which we haven't dealt with yet, the tail end of, well, why does the segmentata fall out of use?
It's interesting that we're still obsessed about the putting a time frame on all of these pieces. I mean, we're falling into it right now, and yet you constantly come back to the fact that actually none of this can be pinned down. Everybody's going to have a variety of the armor. Lorica that's going to be worn in a legion. You've got Hamata, you've got scale. I think, I don't know if it's ever going to be able to be said, like, get away from the dates, somehow come up with a different terminology as such.
But this is the sort of historical, or the way we like to do topologies, right? We like to be able to organize. That's how 21st century people think.
Yeah, I mean, and even when in terms of people just like their pigeonhole, like even our pigeonholes, whereas regnal dating, or in case of the Roman city, from the foundation of the city, the Ad Urbe Condita. So we go, oh no, it's first century AD, but that would make no sense to anyone until, Bede's the first one who starts using years AD, but I don't think he's using centuries. So that idea, you would talk about Augustus, and then you would talk about Tiberius. You wouldn't talk about the pigeonholes that we talk about. And then of course there are other ways of putting things into context that other scholars do. And I just think it's that ease of defining. I mean, even with Augustus, we don't see his career as a singular event. We see it as the Octavian years. Then you have early Augustus, middle Augustan, late Augustan. So there's kind of like, even within the box, you get the sub boxes. And bizarrely, like with an emperor who doesn't last as long, like Caligula, you don't get early Caligula, middle Caligula, and late Caligula, like a year long each. But it's this peculiar. It's easier to deal with in bite-sized chunks, I suppose. Whereas the big picture, we don't really know. But from 15 BC to about, we think, 200 AD, this sort of armor is being used by various people at that. I think makes people feel wishy-washy. But the reality is that the wishy-washy is what we can really be certain of, as opposed to the definitive, this is when it was being worn, this is when it stopped being worn, which is, I think, what people expect us to be like when we're talking. And what I find with a lot of modern historians and students, they get very disgruntled when you go, what do you mean you don't know? Why can't you tell me when this happened or who this was or what this means? And you're like, because we're not quite sure. This is one theory. This is another theory. You're like, oh, but which one is it? Tell me the truth. You're like, well.
So, for example, Melvin Bragg, when he's doing In Our Time, and many of the listeners will have heard him, he gets very frustrated when he gets his professors saying, well, we think it's it. What do you mean you only think? We don't know. What do you mean? This is the trouble I have with ancient
history. In the case of the armor, we have plenty of evidence that there is different types of armors are being used at the same time. You see scale and probably painted hamata on tombstones. There are remains of that stuff. We have evidence of Imperial Gallic type helmets, Weisenau helmets, if you want to call them that, in use very early, while there are still Colus helmets around that appear even in Britain, when they're supposed to be by then almost a century old as a type. And we know from the ownership inscriptions in many of those helmets that they're just being reused and stuff. It's not like an order comes down from Rome. This type of armor is now, it's going to go and we'll send it to the dump and we can sell it to auxiliaries or something because you're all going to get a new Model A.
Yeah, and the bizarre thing is, when people dig them out of the ground today, you still get the report that the blade's still sharp or the armor's still wearable. You're like, yeah, that's 1,000, 2,000 years later. You could have worn it 100 years outside of its date typology, and it still would have been an effective piece of armor. And the peculiar thing about that, from our perspective, is it's somehow a weakness. And yet, when you look at Napoleonics, when there's an ordinance that shakos will be replaced, and that doesn't because of one particular regiment didn't want to or didn't get it, and was wearing the old style at such and such a battle. That's somehow detail. But when we go, well, they're probably still wearing the old ones, it's somehow a weakness of knowledge, and as opposed to a detail.
It's fascinating, but of course also the uniform degree to which an ancient army would have been uniform in its appearance. We've discussed many times before. Before we started on the podcast, we briefly touched on the legions in the Teutoburg Forest. It's a topic that I'm sure fascinates a lot of people. We know that 3 legions disappeared. There is clear evidence for one, which is on the famous tombstone of Marcus Caelius, where there's reference to the Clades Variana, and he is he Primus Pilus of the 18th Legion? There's evidence. There's a tiny bit of archaeological evidence. There's a stamped catapult bolt, and there's a lead ingot, I think, that are both stamped for the 19th Legion in Germany, which makes it very likely, as there's only that evidence and nothing else, that indeed was the 2nd Legion that was involved. And there is, as far as I know, no evidence whatsoever for the 3rd. But because we have apparent series from 1 to 20 and 17 is missing, it seems likely that that's the 3 legions, 17, 18, and 19. It's been supposed that I think the 17th Classica Legion, that was one of Marcus Antonius's legions, might have been the one that was involved. I think that's the extent of the evidence.
But again, when I mentioned Capisa earlier, I mean, that's produced this phenomenal find of this near complete lorica, whichever you want to call it, Schienenpanzer, which sounds much better. Is that what else will they find there? I mean, the one thing that always is elusive to me is the fact that there's nothing at that site that ties it specifically to those legions. And also, of course, the Battle of Saltus Teutoburgiensis was actually a whole series of ambushes over 4 days, so a great distance. So Calcisa would, if it is associated, would only be one point on that long route. So wouldn't it be interesting to find the other places?
Yeah, I think the problem now is that when you've got this debate over sites, that the evidence is found to fit the narrative that it is the site. So getting the idea that it maybe isn't the site is something that people get very upset about early on, and they'll look, or they'll paste over the flaws in the argument, and they'll look to support the argument as opposed to looking at it independently.
And taking that point, Murray, which is a very well made one, Museum and Park Calcisa even admits so. I mean, they had a couple of years ago, I think, Germanicus recognizing it could equally be the campaigns of Germanicus. So my understanding is that they present evidence, and they kind of let people make their own conclusions from that. But it's a fascinating site. It was clearly a conflict site from the first couple of decades of the 1st century AD/CE. And what else could it produce? That's what's so exciting about this whole thing.
It's just that it does seem to match the descriptions of the Saltus, which is not just a forest but also a narrows, very well, because the site, as we explained in the special, which is now 14 years old, the Calcresa site is on the northern edge of a large hill, and it borders, or it used to border, a swamp on the other side, and there was a very narrow track in between the two. And Major Tony Clun, who famously discovered, quote unquote, the site, tracked by metal detecting, he found a track of coins that seems to come from somewhere further east, near the Weser River, and it concentrates at Calcresa, and then there's a lot of finds, and then from there are I think there are 2 sort of tracks that fan out, one going back to the southwest towards the fortresses on the Rhine, and one going further to the sort of west and northwest. And the supposition is that those are the surviving legionaries who try and break out and make their way back home. and some know where they're going and others don't.
It's amazing when you get that narrative of archaeological finds, which is glorious. But there are so many other circumstances where we get archaeological finds of a similar nature, a single coin or a couple of coins, and they still are, we don't know. Like the ones on one of the islands in the Baltic Sea, there's 2 Roman coins, and an uninhabited island on the Baltic Sea, and you're like, nope, no idea what they're doing there, no idea who put them there or how they got there. Just don't mention them again. So whereas with the Clun and others, you get this kind of very tight packed narrative. I mean, I think in the last week there was a helmet, a Corinthian helmet found in Israel. I think I saw that announced somewhere. Which 6th century they're dating the helmet to, alters the whole kind of like what's a Greek Corinthian helmet doing in what is now Israel in the 6th century BC. That doesn't fit with any narrative.
That's the interesting. Yeah, we always question that we find this archaeological material and they're trying to match it to an event or something that we already know about. But I believe that the famous 3rd century, of course, Hartshorn battlefield further in Germany is thought to belong to one of the campaigns of Maximinus Thrax, but we don't. It may also be an unknown campaign or an unknown battle that we suddenly found evidence for.
So to that very point about unknown, it's always amazing when I page through Cassius Dio, sort of 53 through to whenever I finished reading 59 or something, it is that he sweeps across as that there were conflicts, none terribly interesting to mention, and then moves on to the next political development, and you're going, no, because you have no idea what happens. And then you add to that the lacunae, where literally the history has disappeared on the page. And I think what this highlights, to your point, is the danger of trying to match these things precisely, because it's not possible, and it can lead to some slightly ridiculous false theories, I think, because when some other evidence comes, now you've got some evidence that doesn't fit the theorem. Of course, it makes our job as historians fascinating and really exciting, because we can keep writing issues about it.
I mean, it's always the case though with the burials of equipment. Do you bury new equipment? Do you bury important sentimental equipment? Do you bury old equipment? Is it a combination? Is it battle spoil? Therefore, again, it could be old or new, if you're bending a sword or a helmet from someone that you defeated. But that idea that it fits, it was made in 15 BC because it's in a 15 BC context that we find it. You're like, oh no, it could be a century older. Could be,
I just find it fascinating. The books that I would have been reading when I was a young kid, and they'd had like Ladybird books and Did You Know and all sorts of things. And they'd have the standard depiction in a painting of a Caesarean legionary, of course, wearing the banded armor, the Stirnpanzer. And they might have got it right.
I think the one of the things that annoys me that you're not allowed to do today, I was reading Syme's Tacitus, 1958, and several points he goes, you know what, this evidence doesn't exist yet, but they're going to find it. You're like, what? You can't speculate like that. But sure enough, in 1987, they find the evidence to back him up, or in 2005, they find the evidence to back up that footnote. You're like, oh.
But that's the great thing about, I take Lindsay's point about, don't try to go and search for, specific battles to match the, et cetera. But actually, at the same time, you think of all these battles that we haven't got locations set for and whatnot, and say, actually, there's a huge amount of prospect out there for that we're going to come across something that's actually going to change our knowledge of either the historical event or the equipment that's being used there. And you can take it, the prime example is, of course, we're not talking about unknown battles or little known skirmishes. We're talking about well-known battles like the Iceni revolt, where we haven't actually got a final battle site. Everybody's been searching for one for years across Britain and whatnot. There's prospect of, there's some that have been suggested based on, a couple of slingshot, shots. But apart from that, there might be something out there that's going to change our knowledge. So,
and there's not a week that goes by without some amazing metal detectorist find in Europe.
Well, there was another one in just recently in Spain in terms of they've turned up now another town that actually they've linked to the Sertorius rebellion and saying actually all those locations that we can't pinpoint in terms of the narratives for Sertorius's movement across Spain, maybe this is one of them. So that's outside Zaragoza.
And of course, we do find them sometimes where you can match it. I mean, there's famously extensive archaeological research done in Velzen, which is near Amsterdam, where a fort was excavated where with clear signs of fighting and lots of sling bullets in, I think we discussed it on the podcast before years ago, with different kinds of slingshot. Perfectly made slingshot furthest out, and it gets rougher and rougher until it's thumb shaped, where somebody just stuck their thumb in the sand, poured some lead in it, and slung it away. And that perfectly fits an attack on a Roman fort in 28 AD during a Frisian revolt. I mean, that is, when those things match, it's absolutely great.
By the way, this is why I think it's so good that you, Jasper, actually have 4 pages of news in every single issue, because actually things get discovered, right? And we can report on those things and, the theories that people have about them, knowing that they're going to be, turned over several times. And then in the fullness of issues, they'll appear as a proper looked at article. But the point is that all of these things are wonderful because they cause us to re-examine our suppositions and our traditional ideas about things. And, you look at the sources and you realize that they're really summaries. They're not complete in any definition of that word. And I think as historians, we're always eager to hunger for the latest insight.
Yeah, it's the eyewitnesses to war are few and far between in our sources. We have Josephus, but there's always issues with any source. But when it comes to people who participated, I mean, Velleius Paterculus is one in the 1st century AD, but when you're relying on Tacitus, you're not relying on someone who participated. Dias Cassio and even Zonaras and Philinus are summarizing Cassius Dio. So, the next one's Ammianus, and then after that's Procopius. But, when you actually look at who are the people who actually took part in these things that they're telling us about, very few, Xenophon, Thucydides, Polybius, and then you're jumping forward to, Julius Caesar, obviously. But most of our historians are indeed armchair, and they may still record things that were passed down by people through filters who were involved. But most of the stuff we rely on is literary rather than...
And they've created some of the ideas that have sort of, persisted. Like, for example, if you could take, the formation of the army fort for the Romans, that's, coming from Polybius, it's so established from that point on in terms of the nature and the, organization of it. It's sort of reinforced by Paterculus. But other than that, we're sort of relying on the archaeology, modern archaeology, in terms of those ideas and textbooks have stuck. Again, it's fertile ground for whether we can actually prove against those established ideas.
No fort has been found that fits the literary description of either Polybius or Hyginus. You're like, why is this not a problem?
Well, and even more bizarrely, I mean, it's sent through my Augustus at War, and I used illustrations from, I think it was Mike Bishop, ground plans, and none of those Augustan forts are playing card shape. Not a single one, with the exception of maybe Halton, which is slightly skewed, because they actually built the forts to fit the topology of the landscape. And at some point later, I'm going to guess maybe under Claudius, but certainly by the time of the Flavians, they had sort of come more to a consistent playing card shape. And maybe they'd read by genes.
What do we think of the stationing of legions inside fortresses, which begins in permanent fortresses in this period? Because is it true, would you say, that the striking power of a legion was reduced by its permanent or semi-permanent stationing in a particular locale, and then as effectively as like a frontier guard? And that meant that while the Roman Empire had many men under arms, actually forming them into some sort of striking groups, armies that could go out on campaign, were made more difficult by the need to hold that territory, not simply defend the territory, but hold it down even. So the legion didn't change in its overall organization, but where it was placed, in the same place, year after year. Did that have some sort of deleterious impact on what Rome could achieve? Because when the Romans wanted to put together a field army, they would have to draw soldiers from much deeper inside the empire to actually get anything accomplished.
I think you're fixating on the idea that it's where the camp is going to be established. I think what we're missing in our sources, and it comes through a little bit in Caesar's Gallic campaigns, is that a fort can be organized differently in terms of the purpose of the fort, or what the commander wants to get out of the fort. There's one, I can't think of where it is. There's one that he orders that the ramparts are increased in size. So he's got a triple velation, I think, outside, triple vallum outside, and I think I'm right in saying a 3-meter rampart with screen on top. And the idea is perhaps that he's actually trying to put to the enemy that he's maybe a little bit, shy of the enemy, in order to draw them in as such, and it's actually part of his strategy. And I think it's just one example, but maybe we're missing a lot of other examples, and we're always focusing on where are the forts, what is the strategic advance strategy in terms of frontiers that we're looking at.
And Mark, as in DeSantis, that I would also suggest this is that a lot of these places were not permanent. I mean, the Romans refer to them as winter camps, but they also talked about summer camps, and the summer camps are moving forward and backwards. And at some point, they will decide, okay, we're going to retreat back to the place nearer the river for the winter. So, in fact, what you end up with is a kind of like a cordon, not almost sanitaire, which is sort of nominally Roman, but kind of maybe not held in the sense I think you might be referring to. That's wherever the winter camp is. And what's fascinating is that, again, looking through the German campaign of, for example, Drusus and later Tiberius, is the extent to which they keep coming back to the same places, and the archaeology shows 1, 2, or 3, 4, sort of one laid on top of the other. So they find places which are natural places for them to go to, but in fact, what they may well say, no, but actually we're building Anreppen or Osnabrück or something as where we're going to be based, on some longer term idea that maybe they'll be advanced up the river in 4 campaigns front. So it's a lot more temporary, I think, than we might imagine.
Mind you, at the same time, I think it's also the stamp of Roman presence, on the Rhine frontier or the Danube frontier becomes very established early. And even in Britain, where you have the initial invasion, you've got, the camps in Gloucester and Lincoln, I think. But by the period we're talking about, and again, it's debated as to when is Chester founded, when is York founded, and when is Caerleon founded. The idea used to be it's all Agricola. Anything of any importance in Roman Britain is done by Agricola. And now the idea is, no, actually, probably by Petilius Cerealis, maybe even before him. And then Agricola builds on what's been done before he arrives, not establishing it. And so the idea there is, those 3 cities in Roman Britain, York, Chester, and Isca, the city of the legion, which is like, well, that's any city with a legion, surely. Those 3 become not only this return to this place, even if you go further north in the summer, but they also become symbols of Roman presence. Now, obviously, the detriment of that is when Boudica revolts, she knows that Suetonius Paulinus is, on Mona, and that the Roman legionary camps are far away from where she heads. So, Colchester is vulnerable. London is vulnerable. St. Albans is vulnerable. Again, one of the problems with the literary sources is a revolt or is presented as a barbarous kind of idea of it's just ad hoc. They're just rampaging. And the idea that these native people in revolt have intelligence and reconnaissance and scouts is generally rejected because of the Roman narrative. And the Romans eventually win, so they can tell whatever narrative they like. But, in the meantime, the idea that they knew where the Romans were, they knew the Romans weren't going to be able to respond to them quickly, is part of the warfare they're fighting. So,
and I'll just throw these kind of, so building on that idea, and then also tying some threads here, is that we go back to Quintilius Varus. It's very clear from, I think, Cassius Dio that Roman cohorts, centuries even, are deployed across Germany, and in fact, Arminius uses that easy to encircle and obliterate. And in fact, so what that points to is the fact that there are not complete whole legions on the march with Varus. They are much smaller than that. On the other hand, you get the impression from, like, let's say, the Claudian invasions of the army groups. And so, for example, the one of, let's say, Vespasian going out to the southwest, they go as far as Isca, which is Exeter, right? And in fact, that would probably be a vexillation fort, so it'd be a legion plus auxiliaries. They might have coastal support as well, because the coast allows you to do that. And then they move further into Wales, and they start in Usk, like Caerleon, interesting enough, and they discovered that Usk isn't very good from a flood protection point of view, so they have to move further up the coast in that way. But I think what you see is a much more fluid tactical army in campaign, and they will assemble or disassemble units as they need to. They'll literally slough off units and say, and to Mark DeSantis' point, your job is to hold this territory in large part as a supply chain line. The army moves forward, it's going to forage, but it also relies on this logistics train that's going to be bringing things up, arms as well as food and so forth up the front. And presumably they have to have some place where they can have arms dumps. And again, in the German campaign, I think Rödgen is one of those, which is actually basically a collection of blocks for granaries. And it just seems to be that the ship would come up the Ems River or something, or maybe it would do the Lippe, and the stevedores would unload all the stuff. The ship would go back to Xanten or somewhere, and then those would be on newly built roads going off to wherever the frontier is. So it's quite fascinating. This very dynamic.
It's a certain degree of opportunism, isn't it, as well? Because, like, in terms of Vespasian moving across the south, I'm thinking of the Dorset camps, and that a number of them are actually centered on hill forts, occupying previously held positions that tried and tested. So,
but also stamping Roman presence on a previously un-Roman place. I think the other thing is that the idea of the vexillation as a strategy, detaching sections from legions, is again later. We find it in the 2nd century AD. But when you look at, for instance, the army that's marching back from Judea to secure Vespasian's claim to the throne in 69, those are vexillations from all of his legions. So the idea that you're detaching bits from legions to go and fight in other campaigns, so that idea for us of like, but is it the legion? Do they have the standard with them? It's like, well, no, presumably the standard's with the legion, and this vexillation of 1,000 men from that legion isn't using the legionary standard, because there's only one of those. It's using its own standards, which are still identifiable. But
you've got that wonderful example of the 9th Legion moving over to Germany somewhere, isn't it? That they are using a different standard in terms of they are using the IX as
the numbering, the way they write the number changes from IX to VIII.
Exactly, the VIII is the actual legion itself, and yet the vexillation is taking this different identity with it.
Well, then, just to build on my point, just at the beginning of this, it was that with the stationing of the legions in fortresses, that is in what I'll call them permanent fortresses, did it make the legion itself, once again, not tactically less proficient, but as a matter of force projection, that is less useful, because you then had to take all of these vexillations, detachments, however you want to call them, scrape all of these men together and then send them on campaign, because the legion had to still maintain some sort of presence back on the Rhine. But go ahead.
I think what we also have to be careful about is that we tend to think of the legions in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC as campaign armies only. from an archaeological point of view, there's been archaeological research in France where they're looking for Caesar's campaigns. There's quite a bit of archaeological research in Spain looking for the Spanish campaigns and Punic Wars. Otherwise, most of the archaeological research and what we know about Roman camps is in Germany, this country, and in Britain, which is the Imperial era. But there are indications that there are legions more or less permanently across the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 1st century BC, because there have to be garrisons. We just don't really know what they do and how they do it, but they are clearly in a, they hold some kind of permanent position, and it's hard to imagine that some of these improvisations. I mean, Caesar does all kinds of stuff with cohorts, several cohorts from this. In fact, he talks often about, having an army consisting of so many cohorts instead of an army consisting of so many legions. So presumably this idea of just putting your army together out of cohorts is older than the Imperial era. So I am not sure if we can really say that there is a difference in, armies that change from a real campaign setup to more permanent setup, and when that happens, even then, that is a gradual. It is a gradual transition where you get the stone fortresses appear fairly late in the period that we're discussing today, and that might have something to do with other things too.
Let me tie a few threads then to be provocative. I think that there is more a moment in time when you can tie it down. And it's interesting that we talked about Claudius and the issue, and I think he's one of the agents of change in that. But it was actually, I think, really more Tiberius. I'm thinking specifically of the Rhine-Danube frontier. And it comes down basically, so we talked about Teutoburg. That would be a point at which the high command, if you want to call it that, would reflect on, what are we going to do? And it's clear when Augustus dies that he hasn't abandoned Germany. He actually basically puts Germanicus in a position ready to go reclaim it, which he is indulged by Tiberius. And there's a point by 16 where he said, enough's enough, you're coming back. And then you start to see more of a permanent frontier. And they're still largely wooden forts at that point. And then by the time you get to Claudius, then you start to see the stone building was. It is, in a sense, in stone, a manifestation of strategic thought and tactical policy. And what's interesting, though, is he hasn't given up expanding the empire, because guess where he's going? He's going to Britain. So the idea hasn't been abandoned. But to Mark's point, I think you can point to a moment in time or a decade where more of a permanence in strategy takes over.
Yeah. And then, but weirdly, it's not permanent in that sense of this is the line, because they then push forward, quite late into Rhaetia, and then they expanded to Dacia, later. There's evidence that Vespasian was planning on doing that pre-Domitian.
And, that begs the question that there wasn't really a grand strategy, doesn't it? I mean,
and also that this permanent camp line can shift. That yes, we're building it in stone, but we'll build one in stone at Carnuntum instead, or we'll build one in stone. We'll move to York from Lincoln, and we'll move to Chester from Gloucester and things like that. So it's fascinating, but I think it comes down to what we were talking about early on about the solidity. When we talk about this legion is in this camp permanently, it gives a solid presence, as opposed to, again, and Vindelander proved that you've got a legion, but they're all over the shop. There's less than half of the men are actually in their fort. They're there. The idea that's somehow less solid for a modern ancient historian. Well, they're everywhere. They're not actually where we say they are. There's some over there. There's some fighting there. There's some that way. There's some over there. That's like, but that's not solid. I can't identify. And I think that's probably one of the issues, is that this legion, this city, nowhere else, is a sort of a closed-minded small view, as opposed to, well, yes, nominatively during winter they're there, but rest of the time they could be anywhere else in the empire doing their thing.
Yeah, and you still have to remember that the territory that they're trying to control with rough estimate 450,000 soldiers is quite big. And that's it. There's no police force. I mean, others outside of a couple of big cities, there's no administrative bureaucracy for much of the empire outside Rome itself. That's all the people you have to do everything with.
In fact, at that point, the only document that we know of is actually Augustus keeps this roster, which he keeps pretty quiet. And I think it's one of the 3 documents that's given on his deathbed that Tiberius and actually go, oh my God, you know where they were. Because in effect, you could say knowledge is power. I mean, he actually knew where all the forces were. Because the administration did exist at some nominal level, but not in the way that we would understand. You probably couldn't go to a filing cabinet, pull out a file and say, they're all there. Because they're moving around too much. And I think when you get to Cassius Dio, where he makes this admission, he tries to account for the location of all the regions in their semi or at least permanent camps. But he then gives up trying to actually explain the auxiliaries. He says, I have no idea how many of those they even are. And that probably is the position. They don't know how many there are.
Well, and we find that today. 4 legions, right. Equal number of auxiliaries. There you go. That's how we explain this campaign. You're like, what evidence do you have of that?
Because that's what Tacitus says. It's all based on one sentence.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right.
Well, that looks like we've solved that one then.
Wrap up? I don't know. I was going to throw it in. We can discuss the Roman understanding of, where does the Roman Empire end? And therefore, that's where you build your fortresses. And where does enemy territory begin? But that would be an entirely different discussion that would require a bookcase full of books.
But that's a very interesting question. I was in another part of the podcast on Monday where I was trying to explain Julio Claudians to Alan's Hedegaards. And the point I made there is that in the Res Gestae, Augustus talks about the Imperial Morana, which is basically, it's the power of the Roman people, which hints at things like influence and not necessarily power of a soldier armed with things right here, right now, who can do damage to you. It's Roman influence is far across the borders, far across into places. I mean, that's why the peoples at the Cimbri love Roman daggers and things, because they know they exist. They want them and so on. So in fact, we probably think too black and white about what Roman Empire is. It's a thing of the imagination too, and it goes well beyond the rivers and the hills that Tacitus apparently decided that Augustus was going to stick to,
and well beyond the walls as well.
Mm. Yes,
I was going to say maybe we can try and answer at least one of the questions that we got for this episode, which is, do we know anything about the weapons, organizations, and tactics of the armies of client states? Might first require a slight introduction about client states, which we don't really touch upon in this issue at all. It's there's a bunch of states around the Roman Empire, or sometimes semi-incorporated, that have kings or other kinds of leaders that are nominally independent and allied to Rome. And you should probably think various apostrophes in what I'm saying now. At various times, most of them, I think, during Claudius's reign, some of those are canceled, is one way to put it, and they just become Roman territory. And we presume that they have armies.
It's a difficult area to answer, isn't it? Because client states sort of come and go as well, just like you alluded to. I was going to give 2 examples. One is the Marcomanni and the Marbodus, who was a client king, Claudius, who is educated in Rome, and I think is an equus and learns sort of the Roman military doctrines through that, and then he takes a position in his own country, and the Romans expect great things of him. And it seems to be what he does, in fact, is he moves his people. He actually upsticks and moves them further into what we now would refer to as Bohemian, and they're known as being very Roman in their style of military structure and operation. But beyond a few remarks by Tacitus, it's not really known. But of the other people, the Catti or the Chatti, I'm just reading it here. Tacitus is struck by the similarities between the Chatti and his own countrymen. Quote, the whole strength is in foot soldiers, who, besides carrying their arms, are loaded with tools and supplies. They posted pickets by day and dug ditches around their camps at night, in the same way the legions do. So again, I think, we were talking moments ago about the fact that Roman influence goes out, and people beyond the Roman Empire are not stupid. I mean, they will see good things that they can mimic and copy. You've said earlier that some will be in auxiliary units, and they'll say, that really works. Arminius, case in point. If Chalcedon really is associated with that battle, so-called battle, there's that strange...
You're assuming that it's also going from the Romans to everyone else as well, but I think at the same time the Romans themselves are borrowing a lot of ideas in terms of their armor. And it's, if we talk about the Scutati in Spain, the argument is, is it that the Romans have influence on them in terms of their shield and weaponry, or is it the other way around? And it's an unanswerable question. Really.
Well, to pontificate for the Roman point of view, if we adopt your idea, it becomes Roman. So, well, I think I was going to mention in terms of as far as we know, similarity of a client state's arms and armor and army organization, the Judean under King Herod, I think they're even described in the sources as Roman-esque legionaries of the Judean state. So there's that adoption of the same armor, weapons, shields, presumably organization, but we don't know of legions. And off camera, I was mentioning we get later sources talking to legions and naming them things like the Melitian Legion, which is, we don't know it exists, but one of the Roman legions was in Melitene, but we wouldn't have called it the Melitene Legion, but it's called that in the sources. So is it associated with that area in Turkey? So you do get sort of a shifting idea of is it a local or are they Roman? And I think that comes back to talk about the borders as well, is that depending on your local population, do they view Romans as outsiders or as one of them, which changes over time as they become Romanized. If Romans are Romans, it really doesn't matter which legion or which sections of which legions are in town. They're foreigners and they're the enemy or the bad guys or the Romans. And when they become locals, the same thing happens in reverse, that they're locals. So
I would just add that I just mentioned Pontus was a client state, and when it became part of the Roman Empire, the Pontic fleet was just incorporated into the Roman armed forces, and it became the Classis Pontica. And going back, that's why maybe this was a nice way to circle this episode to our discussion about equipment. Apparently, the Romans don't really, there's no indication whatsoever that they care whether, the ships that the Pontic fleet has slightly different models of trireme or Liburna. It's just a warship. Okay, that's good enough. And presumably, when the 22nd Legion Deotariana was more or less gifted to Augustus by Deiotarus, was he the last king of Galatia? I think it just becomes a legion, and we don't know if they had to do anything fancy to make those guys all into Roman citizens, or whether they were just honorary citizens, or they just did something, they just accepted them, it became a legion, and that's it. Stays around for 2 centuries, I think. It disappears in the 2nd century.
Yeah, some people think it was in the Bar Kokhba War, but I don't believe that for a second.
But it's no longer in the list of in the inscription of Marcus Aurelius, I think. So it must have disappeared somewhere between the mid 2nd century. Anyway, that said, I think this is a topic that we can discuss forever, but we're not gonna. So thank you all, and we'll see you again very soon. Bye.